The marble floor in the lobby caught the dim morning light and gave none of it back. Standing on that polished stone in the white gown her mother had chosen, Rebecca Belmont held a bouquet of roses in one hand and a marriage certificate in the other, and leaned close to the man in the faded shirt so the people by the tall windows wouldn't hear. "I couldn't afford to lose you for money," she whispered, "but you don't have any. That's the only comforting thing about this whole arrangement." She was marrying a stranger to erase her family's debt, and she had no idea that the marble under her feet, the tower above her head, and the man in the worn shirt were all worth more than she could count. Stay to the end of this one and subscribe before you do, because the poorest man in that room was about to turn out to be the richest, and the moment the truth lands will be worth the wait. Matthew didn't take offense at the cruelty. He looked down at the flowers, then back up at her with a calm that almost passed for a small smile. He was 36, a laborer, his hands calloused and split from years of hard work, his shirt washed so many times it had forgotten its original color. A worn canvas bag hung from his shoulder, and poking out of the top upside down was a small teddy bear missing one plastic button eye. Behind them, lined up along the glass wall, her family looked at him the way people look at a stain on an expensive tablecloth. Her mother, Amelia Belmont, stood ramrod straight beside a wealthy man in a tailored suit who wore a thin, condescending smile. Two more relatives in dark clothes counted the minutes until the whole humiliating business was over. Not one of them standing in that lobby of glass and stone knew the truth that the entire soaring tower they were using as a backdrop to look down on a poor man belonged to him. Rebecca signed first, using her mother's fine fountain pen because Amelia Belmont would sooner have died than let her daughter sign an official record with a plastic pen from a corner store. Rebecca's hand didn't shake. She'd learned long ago to hide everything behind a still face. She signed her full name in the precise cursive her mother had drilled into her over childhood thank you notes, then held out the pen. Matthew took it the way he'd take a borrowed tool, testing its weight before he set it to the paper. He wrote only his first name and left the family name off entirely. The notary, who had witnessed hundreds of high society weddings, raised one eyebrow and said nothing. In his line of work, discretion was sold by the hour. "That completes the paperwork," said the lawyer in the gray coat. Two dry words in a quiet hall carrying more weight than either of them. A plain band slid onto Rebecca's finger, a cheap ring bought by size instead of taste. She would have to give it back in 6 weeks anyway. Everything in her life was borrowed now: the gown, the family name, and the husband. No one called for a kiss. In a real wedding, someone would have. But this wasn't a marriage. It was a transaction, wearing a marriage's clothes, and transactions get signed fast before feelings can complicate them. Outside, the midday sun hammered down on the wide concrete plaza. The skyscraper behind them was the tallest tower on the bay, and the name on the security fence read Alcazar Group. Rebecca went down the stone steps still holding the roses, only because she didn't know what else to do with them. Her family followed in a neat line trailing expensive perfume and poorly hidden relief. Amelia caught up with her at the bottom step and spoke without moving her lips, a skill perfected by women who deliver insults in public without drawing a crowd. 6 weeks, Rebecca. 42 days. You smile, you tolerate the working class, and then you sign the cancellation and come home. She adjusted her daughter's veil with 2 fingers, a gesture that from a distance looked like affection. "No one needs to know how far we've fallen. That stays between us." She glanced at Matthew, who stood 3 steps off, holding his bag, and couldn't find a word low enough for him. "His name is Matthew," Rebecca said. "His name is whatever the documents require it to be." Amelia slid her dark glasses on and put her cold face back where it belonged. "This family doesn't lose. It takes temporary pauses." By a luxury sedan at the curb stood Samuel Arietta, the man who had promised Rebecca a life overlooking the bay 2 years ago, then walked away the moment her family name started drawing questions in the social clubs. He leaned against the car with his tie loosened, wearing the soft pity of a man raised never to raise his voice. "I couldn't resist coming to watch," Samuel said. He looked Matthew over, head to boots, letting his eyes settle on the canvas bag and the upside-down teddy bear, and offered a small, knowing smile. "Call me when the situation settles down, Rebecca. You know where to find me." She didn't answer. She learned early that silence frustrated men like Samuel more than any argument because it gave them nothing to work with. She walked past him, but she felt his gaze linger on the stuffed toy, the way a man marks a weakness to use later, and for the first time that morning, she felt something rise in her that wasn't shame or exhaustion. It was the instinct to protect. The vehicle waiting for them was not her family's. It was an old work truck with a wooden bed full of planks and a tin of nails rattling on the passenger seat. Matthew moved the tin, opened her door, before circling to the driver's side, an old habit he performed without thinking, despite her gown and his overwashed shirt. He started the engine, and as they pulled away, the glass tower shrank in the mirror until it was a small rectangle and then nothing at all. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Rebecca watched the city change through the window glass and marble, giving way to brick, then to laundry, strung between narrow balconies like flags of some quiet, unfinished war. Every block carried her further from her old life, and a cold part of her mind, the part her mother had built, kept a running tally of the descent like a debt. "You can throw the flowers out if you want," Matthew said finally. "There's no vase for them at the apartment." "They aren't really mine either. My mother picked them." He nodded slowly, accepted it without prying, and put his eyes back on the road. She was grateful for the silence. She'd ridden in too many cars with men who asked gentle questions only to use the answers later. The truck pulled up in front of a modest three-story building on a quiet street in Savannah, Georgia. The shared stairwell smelled faintly of home cooking from a dozen apartments. They climbed to the second floor, but before Matthew could get his key in the lock, the door opened from the inside. A small girl stood in the doorway, maybe 5 years old, thin and pale with large, watchful eyes that had clearly learned to look before they spoke. She gripped the frame with both hands and studied Rebecca from head to toe, without fear and without a greeting, carrying the quiet seriousness of a child who had already lost something and had decided not to lose anything more. "Who's that?" the girl asked, looking up at her father. "This is Rebecca," Matthew said gently. "She's going to stay with us for a while." "How long?" Matthew opened his mouth, then closed it without a word. You could fool the whole world, but there were certain honest eyes at home that excuses couldn't get past. Rebecca watched him hesitate and saw something she hadn't expected in the man her family had dismissed. He wasn't afraid of the child. He was afraid of disappointing her. "We'll see how it goes," he said, "day by day." The girl weighed that and clearly found it wanting. "We'll see," was the empty thing adults said when they had no better answer, and she knew it. She gave Rebecca one last look, the white gown, the borrowed flowers, the unwanted ring, and decided right then that her affection would not come cheap. She turned and walked back inside, dragging a one-eyed teddy bear by its ear across the floorboards. The apartment was one open room divided by plain furniture. In the center stood a hand-built wooden table with two mismatched chairs and a smaller child's seat. Behind a curtain in the corner lay a small mattress. Along one wall, a collection of tools hung from pegs with striking precision, each in its assigned place, the sign of a household where useful work was respected. "That's your room," Matthew said, nodding at the only door. "I'll take the couch. Lucy sleeps behind the curtain." He read the apprehension before she could hide it. "Our agreement is a piece of paper, not an obligation. You can sleep with the door shut and not worry about a thing." Rebecca looked at him and said nothing. It was the most considerate thing anyone had said to her all day, and he delivered it with the blunt honesty of a man unused to polishing his words. She set the fading bouquet on the table, and a single petal drifted down into the fine sawdust. "What do you build?" she asked to fill the quiet. He hung the canvas bag on his peg, the teddy bear dangling upside down, watching them with his one eye. "Whatever's needed. Walls, roofs, foundations." He wiped his hands on his trousers out of old reflex. "People think a building's strength comes from how tall it is. It doesn't. It comes from how deep you set the foundation. The part that holds everything up is usually the part nobody ever sees." He caught himself. "Sorry, I get serious about the work." Rebecca held on to the words. Something in them ran deeper than carpentry, and she wasn't yet equipped to say how. That night, while Lucy pretended to sleep behind the curtain and Matthew worked downstairs, smoothing a board to quiet his thoughts. Rebecca sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed, still in her gown, for lack of anything else, and counted 42 nights, and then the papers, and then her old life. She whispered the number to make it real. 42. But for a reason she couldn't name, the number that should have felt like a sentence had begun strangely to feel like something else. Outside, the steady rhythm of the hand playing went on patient, even taking the rough edges off one pass at a time. The first night was the longest she'd ever known, and she'd known many hard ones. Sleep wouldn't come. The mattress was firmer than she was used to, and the cotton sheets smelled of laundry soap and open air, which was oddly comforting. What kept her awake was the quiet itself. In her mother's house, silence was manufactured by expensive machines, humming in the background, climate control, electric gates. Here the quiet was alive. The floorboards ticked. A pipe dripped. Behind the curtain, Lucy shifted and murmured fragments to someone who wasn't there anymore. Around 2 in the morning, she got up for water and tiptoed across the main room to find Matthew sitting upright on the sofa in the dim light, staring at the ceiling. "There's fresh water in the pitcher," he said without turning his head. "Hands get tired before the mind does. Feels backward. But you don't get to choose the order." Rebecca drank by the window. Below, the narrow street was empty, except for a stray dog crossing under a distant lamp. Nothing here looked like her old life, and yet standing in the quiet with the man who wanted nothing from her, she felt something rare. The relief of a place that asked her to perform nothing. "My mother's coming Friday," she said. "She wants to see that I'm miserable. If I look content, she'll think I've given up." She set the glass down. "I'm just serving out a sentence." Matthew nodded in the shadow without reaching for easy comfort. A man used to heavy work knew better than to talk another person's burden down. "I'll make soup for Friday," he said, and there was a faint dry humor in it. Feeding uncomfortable guests usually gets them to leave sooner. Rebecca nearly smiled and went back to her room before it could finish forming. The site where Matthew worked was 40 minutes out in a fast-growing stretch of savanna, another tower going up in modern glass, some distant owner's name on the fence. Rebecca went there once that first week to bring an insulated flask he'd left behind because Lucy refused to stay alone with her, which meant all three of them took the truck. She watched him a while before he noticed her and found it genuinely hard to square this man with the one from the ceremony. In that polished lobby, among tailored suits, he had seemed out of place, head down, swallowing quiet contempt. Here, in a hard hat and leather tool belt, he was a different man entirely. The other workers came to him with real respect, asking his read on the technical details. The foreman, an older man named Henry with heavy white eyebrows, stood over a blueprint spread across an empty drum. Matthew put his finger on a spot on the diagram. "You'll get stress fractures here if we don't reinforce it," he said, and Henry agreed without a second's argument. While Matthew went down into the pit for the flask, Henry ambled over to Rebecca. "That man reads a building like other people read the morning paper," the foreman said with a gentle chuckle. "A fellow with that talent could work anywhere he wanted. Corner office, drafting table, name on the door, and he picks foundation work. In the mud. Every time." The phrase stayed with her next to his own comment about foundations. She added them both to a growing collection of things this quiet man almost never said about himself. When Matthew came back with the flask, his hand brushed hers. An ordinary thing, passing an object between two people. But his palm was warm and rough from the day's work, and having spent her life among soft hands, her mother Samuel's, the lawyer's, who had never carried a load, she felt the roughness sharply like cold water after a long thirst. She pulled her hand back too fast and regretted it at once, because the movement showed how much the touch had registered. "Thanks for coming out," Matthew said. He nodded toward the truck where Lucy sat with her bear. "She doesn't ride along for just anybody." Then he went back down into the deep pit, leaving Rebecca with a quiet gratitude she didn't know where to put. The turning point came 3 nights later, and not from any conversation. It came from a fever. Rebecca woke at 3 in the morning to a rough, persistent cough behind the curtain. She sat up. Lucy was crying softly, the worn-out cry of a sick child who has spent all her strength calling for help. Rebecca waited a few seconds for Matthew to go to her, then remembered he was working an overnight concrete pour and wouldn't be home until morning. The two of them were alone. A little girl who didn't trust her and a woman who could easily have stayed in bed. No one would have blamed her. Lucy wasn't her daughter. This wasn't her home. 39 days left and then her old life. But the crying went on thinner each time, and something in that sound went straight past every lesson her mother had taught her about boundaries and keeping your distance. Rebecca got up, crossed the cold floorboards barefoot, and drew back the curtain. Lucy was burning up, cheeks, flushed hair stuck to her forehead, the teddy bear clutched hard against her chest. When she saw Rebecca, she tried to look like she didn't need help. "I didn't call you," Lucy said weakly. "I want my dad." "Your dad's working." Rebecca knelt by the small mattress and kept her voice plain, no syrup in it. "So tonight you've got me." Maybe because the girl distrusted false sweetness, having lost too much too early, she let a little of her guard down. Rebecca had never cared for a sick child. In her family, that was what the staff were for, but she had common sense. She wet a clean cloth with cool water for the girl's forehead, found the fever medicine in the cabinet, and measured out the dose by the light of her phone. She talked low and steady about nothing, the stray dog on the street, the far-off sound of night traffic, just to give Lucy a voice to hold on to. "Does Toby get sick too?" the girl asked, half asleep. "Sometimes, but bears are tougher than people. He'll sit up with you all night and never once complain." "You're not complaining either." "No," Rebecca said. "I'm not." Lucy considered that with the gravity of a child taking careful measurements and filed it away somewhere Rebecca couldn't see. She remembered from her own childhood that the worst part of a fever wasn't the heat, it was the loneliness. Her mother had always sent someone from the staff, a kind enough woman with cool hands and a schedule, and Rebecca had learned early that being tended to was not the same as being sat with, so she stayed and she sat. Near dawn, the fever broke and Lucy drifted off. Before she went under, her small fingers groped across the blanket until they closed around Rebecca's wrist and held on tight. Rebecca stayed on the floor with a numb arm, unwilling to pull free and risk waking her. In the gray morning light, she understood something that unsettled her more than any debt caring for this child. In this small room, with her hands felt more natural and more clean than anything she'd done in years. That was how Matthew found them when he came home, caked in cement dust after 12 hours of labor. He stood in the doorway and looked at the woman in plain clothes sitting barefoot on the floor, holding his sleeping daughter's wrist. He said nothing, but something shifted in his tired face. For the first time since the ceremony, he looked at Rebecca not as a temporary obligation, but as someone who might be capable of holding a home up from underneath. The teddy bear, lost an arm the following Tuesday from too much play rather than neglect. Lucy, fully recovered and running at full speed, had dragged him through so many imaginary adventures that the worn stitching finally gave, leaving the limb hanging by a single thread. She stared at the damaged lip, trembling a genuine catastrophe. "I can fix him," Rebecca offered. Lucy pulled the toy to her chest and looked at her with honest suspicion. "Do you even know how to sew?" Rebecca held out her hand. "Needlework is one of the few useful things anyone ever taught me. We'll have him fixed before bedtime. What's his name?" "Toby." Lucy hesitated. "My mom named him before I can even remember." After a long moment of consideration, the girl handed the bear over, watching Rebecca's hands the whole time, as though the way a person holds a broken thing tells you whether they can be trusted with it. Rebecca took a small sewing kit from a tin on the shelf and sat at the wooden table under the yellow light. Lucy sat across from her, watching closely, and started talking the way children do when they think the adult is too busy to really listen. "My mom used to fix Toby's seams," she said softly. Rebecca kept her eyes on the needle. She'd learned in 2 weeks that the girl said the true things only when she wasn't being watched for them. "My dad tries," Lucy went on quieter still, "but his stitches are big and crooked. I don't tell him though. It makes him sad." And that one small confession was the whole shape of the home. A child swallowing her own tiny disappointment to protect her father, and a father with rough hands doing his clumsy best so his daughter would feel taken care of. Rebecca tied off the arm with a firm knot. Then on an impulse, she didn't stop to examine. She took a spare button from her coat and stitched a brand new eye onto the bear where the missing one had been. When she handed him back, Lucy studied the neat seam and the new eye with quiet wonder. She didn't say thank you. She learned to be careful with sudden kindness. But that night she left the curtain of her sleeping nook halfway open for the first time, just enough to see into the main room, just enough not to feel alone if the fever came back. Matthew noticed the open curtain when he came in and didn't say a word about it. But he lay awake on the sofa a long time in the dark, aware that connections were forming under his roof that he hadn't planned for and that once set wouldn't easily come undone. Friday afternoon, Amelia Belmont arrived as promised to inspect her daughter's circumstances. She climbed the 2 flights with an expression of deep reluctance and rang the bell with a gloved hand. When Rebecca opened the door, her mother stepped in without a greeting and swept the room, cataloging every humble detail: the plain table, the mismatched chairs, the smell of cooking from the shared hall. 40 days left, Amelia said with a small sigh, but on the stove a pot of lentil soup was simmering, made by Matthew before his shift, and the smell of it filled the little apartment with something like warmth. Out of courtesy, Rebecca offered a bowl. Amelia examined it with deep skepticism, took one small spoonful, fully prepared to dismiss it, and found she couldn't. The simple soup had a rich, patient flavor you rarely met in expensive restaurants, the taste of someone cooking with care for a household. Passably done, Amelia said at last, setting the spoon down. For a simple home. Matthew made it himself. Her mother waved that off. Cooking is a necessity when you have limited means, Rebecca. Don't mistake it for anything more. She dabbed her lips with a napkin. And don't let yourself get comfortable in poverty. I lived through hardship in my youth. There is no beauty in it. Rebecca didn't argue. But listening to her mother dismiss that warm bowl, she understood at last that the coldness in her life had never come from a small apartment. It had come from the world she'd been raised in. She had spent 24 years in beautiful houses, feeling a chill no heating system could touch. Amelia left earlier than expected, proving Matthew's quiet prediction right. A warm meal really did move a difficult guest along. The afternoon that changed how Rebecca saw everything came on a clear autumn day by the coast. Matthew brought Lucy and Rebecca to the site where the crew was throwing a small party on the 12th floor for Henry's birthday, with a wide view of the city and the ocean beyond it. Rebecca stood near the safety rail, looking out over Savannah, while men with weathered hands shared plain food and honest laughter and treated her with a simple courtesy that had nothing to do with and no knowledge of her family name. Henry came over with a drink and nodded toward Matthew, who had Lucy up on his shoulders near a secured ledge, showing her the bones of the building. He's teaching a 5-year-old to read structural plans, Henry said, amused, showing her where the main columns carry the load. He took a sip and considered. That man could hand that child anything on earth he wanted to, and what he chooses to give her is how a thing stands up from the ground. He looked at Rebecca a beat longer than the words needed. Some men hide what they can do because they're insecure. Others keep it quiet because they were once loved only for their money, and they swore they'd never let that happen again. He let that sit. Matthew's the second kind. Rebecca didn't fully catch the foreman's meaning that day, but she filed it with the rest. Looking across the floor at Matthew, against the autumn sky with his daughter on his shoulders, she no longer saw a man of no means. She saw a man of deep character and quiet strength, patient, practical, devoted, and everything her old world had taught her to call unimpressive now looked worth more than all the polish she left behind. Driving home that evening, Lucy asleep between them with Toby clutched tight, Rebecca spoke to the window. My family handed me to a man they thought was nothing, she said, so that no one would care when it ended. She watched the brick street slide by. I wonder if my mother realizes she's treating me the same way. Something to set aside once it stopped being useful. Matthew kept his eyes on the road so long she thought he wouldn't answer. People aren't things you return, he said finally, evenly. You either hold them up or you let them fall. Your mother made her choice. He adjusted his grip on the wheel. In her place, I'd hold you up. They finished the drive without the radio, without hunting for more words, comfortable in a new kind of quiet, the quiet of two people who had started secretly to hope the road wouldn't end soon. Samuel Arrieta was not a man who accepted defeat. He waited for his moment and stepped into Rebecca's path one Thursday as she came back from the market with 2 grocery bags and Lucy at her side appearing on the sidewalk with the easy confidence of a man used to taking up room. Let me get that. He took a bag before she could refuse. We need to talk. He glanced down at Lucy, who stayed close to Rebecca, watching him with open suspicion, and lowered his voice. This whole arrangement is absurd, Rebecca. 4 weeks and you can sign the cancellation and put it behind you. He tried for contrition. I'm sorry I stepped back when your family hit trouble 2 years ago. I was selfish. I'd like to make it right. You left when my name fell, Rebecca said, and you came back the moment it looked like it might recover. She said it calmly. There's nothing to make right. Repairs are for honest mistakes, not for choices. Samuel's charm hardened into something colder. You've developed a taste for the simple life, he said. Don't confuse hardship with dignity. Then he played the card he'd been holding. I looked into your husband. No corporate records, no public profile, nothing under his name at all. A man who leaves no trace is either completely insignificant or he's hiding something very large. He handed back the bag and walked off, leaving her with the groceries and a doubt she hadn't asked for. That night, she watched Matthew with new questions in her mind as he hung his bag on the peg, set his tools in their places, and made dinner with the same quiet composure as always. And she noticed for the first time how strange that composure was. Real financial fear usually showed in the worry over every small expense and the tightness around money. Matthew moved through his days with an absolute calm. A quiet tension sat over the dinner table, both of them carrying thoughts they weren't ready to speak. Amelia moved her schedule up that same week and summoned Rebecca to an upscale cafe in the historic district to go over the plan. At a table dressed in fine linen, her mother told her the notary had confirmed the date. 25 days. The debt is cleared, the family's obligations wiped clean. The annulment gets filed immediately after. You only have to show up and sign. Rebecca looked at the woman across from her who measured every relationship by its usefulness and believed with total conviction that money was the only real shelter against a hard world. What if I don't sign the annulment? She asked quietly. Amelia set her teacup down and dismissed it as foolishness. Then she leaned across the table and took her daughter's hand. Affection without means fades fast, Rebecca. Real hardship turns love into resentment. I've watched it happen. Security is what keeps a marriage alive, not feelings. Rebecca said nothing on the ride home. She felt caught between Samuel's suspicion and her mother's certainty, afraid she might be mistaking something new for something real. When she got back, Matthew read her distress at once and read it wrong. He took the look on her face for regret over the life she was living and pulled back into his own defenses. He'd lost a relationship once to exactly these doubts, and he knew that distant look. You saw your mother, he said, his voice cooling. 25 days left then. He turned back to the stove. Probably best not to get attached to a temporary home. Makes leaving harder. Rebecca stung, and unaware he was only shielding himself, guarded her own pride and answered in kind. You're right. Counting the days is the sensible thing. They ate in silence, a heavy, distant quiet built out of two people's matching fear. Behind the curtain, Lucy felt the shift and held Toby tight and didn't come out to say goodnight. Outside, rain started dripping through a small gap in the ceiling into a metal tin Matthew had set on the floor. Neither of them slept well. Both of them, listening to the water, hit the tin like a clock counting down. It was Lucy who finally broke the impasse 3 days before the signing. Rebecca found her behind the curtain holding Toby, her small face pinched with worry. I heard Daddy on the phone, Lucy said, about 25 days, and the cancellation. She looked up with wide, anxious eyes. Are you going to leave like my mom did? Her voice dropped. My mom didn't want to go, but you want to. Rebecca felt something break open in her chest. She knelt by the little bed. There was no soft explanation that would get past a child who saw through everything. Your mom leaving, she said carefully, was something she couldn't help. Staying or leaving now, that's a choice. Then why do you have to cancel it at all? And Rebecca had no answer. Every reason from her old world, the debt, the family standing, the legal agreement turned to dust in front of this 5-year-old. There was no real reason to leave this home, only fear and the pressure of people who had never wished her well. "I'm not leaving," Rebecca said, and heard how true it was as she said it. "I'm not signing anything. I'm staying, leaky ceilings and all." Lucy searched her face to be sure the promise was real. Then she dropped her guard entirely, threw her arms around Rebecca's neck, and whispered, "Stay, and for the very first time, Mom." Rebecca held the child tight, her own eyes stinging, and over Lucy's shoulder she saw Matthew standing in the doorway. Ha had come home early and heard all of it, and his face was full of something too large for the small room, the realization that she had chosen them freely, with nothing offered in return. That evening she told him plainly, "I won't agree to the annulment. I heard everything my mother said about hardship. I've made up my mind. I want to stay. I'm not asking you for anything but your understanding." Matthew was deeply moved. He came within a breath of telling her the whole truth right there in the small kitchen, but the old fear caught him. If he revealed how much he was worth now, he'd never know whether she'd chosen him or the money. "Give me 3 days," he said, "until the meeting. I promise everything will make sense once the papers are done." Puzzled but certain the real decision was already behind her, Rebecca agreed. The morning of the meeting came clear and bright. They gathered at the downtown notary's office. At 11, Amelia Belmont, impeccably dressed, the family attorney, with his briefcase, Rebecca calm, and Matthew in his one well-ironed shirt. Lucy had been left with Henry for the morning. Waiting in the conference room was the creditor's legal representative, and beside him, uninvited Samuel Arrieta, claiming he'd come to support the Belmont family. Before a single page could be presented, Samuel dropped a file on the table. "I think everyone deserves to know who this man really is," he said. "My people looked into him. No registered companies, no property under his name, no verifiable employment. A man with no trace is a man with something to hide." A heavy silence. Then the elderly representative handling the debt stood up, slowly adjusted his glasses, and looked at Samuel with something close to pity. "You're mistaken, young man," he said. "Matthew doesn't appear as an employee anywhere in the corporate records because he is not an employee." He opened his own official ledger and set it in the center of the table. He requested that his family name be kept off the marriage certificate for personal reasons. So allow me to state it plainly. The sole owner of the Alcazar Group, the primary creditor of the Belmont estate, and the owner of the tower where this wedding took place is Matthew himself. He is one of the most successful builders and property holders in the region. The room went utterly still. Amelia went pale. Samuel stared at the ledger, his flimsy file rendered meaningless in an instant. Rebecca turned to Matthew in astonishment. The man she'd known through plain meals and honest labor and quiet devotion was the hidden figure behind the largest development firm in the city. And Matthew was looking only at her. "I was afraid," he said softly. "I've been valued for my money before, and it cost me everything real. When I met you, the daughter of the one man who treated me with respect, back when I was just a laborer starting out, I wanted to be chosen for who I am, not for what I own." His voice caught. "You stayed when you believed I had nothing. That's worth more than anything I've ever built." Rebecca stepped forward and took his rough hand. "On our wedding day," she said, "I told you the one comforting thing was that you had no money." She almost laughed. "I was wrong about what mattered. It was never your money or your lack of it. It was that you're humble, that you're honest, that you let me choose you for exactly who you are." Amelia stood speechless, unable to process the scale of it. Samuel gathered his papers in silence and walked out of the room without a word, thoroughly humbled. In the end, the family's debt was cleared, not through an annulment, but through the permanent union of two people who had found something rarer than money in each other: trust. They held their real wedding the following spring in a way that matched their values. No marble hall, no elaborate display. Matthew set it up in the wide backyard of Henry's house under the shade of a big oak with simple wooden chairs for the guests. The construction crew came in clean clothes, carrying home-cooked dishes and instruments and flowers cut from their own gardens. Rebecca wore a modest dress and wildflowers that Lucy had carefully tucked into her hair. Lucy was the ring bearer, walking slow across the grass with a small cushion, and resting on the cushion beside the rings sat Toby the teddy bear with his two stitched arms and his two button eyes, a reminder of the mending that had brought them together. Amelia came too and sat quietly among the guests. Before the ceremony, she went to Rebecca and adjusted one of the flowers in her hair with real tenderness. "I'm glad," she said low, "that you chose your own path, that you chose it on character and not on money." It was as close to an apology as Amelia Belmont knew how to come, and Rebecca took it. Instead of moving into some vast mansion, Rebecca and Matthew built a comfortable, well-made home, designed of course around a deep and lasting foundation. It had a big kitchen for family meals and a bright bedroom with east-facing windows for Lucy, so she waked to morning sun every day. Matthew set the mended teddy bear on a prominent shelf in the living room, and when visitors asked about it, he liked to say it stood for the strength of things that are carefully repaired instead of thrown away. 2 years later, their family grew with a healthy baby boy. Matthew held his newborn son with the same careful supporting grip he used on a foundation, making sure the child felt completely secure. Lucy welcomed her little brother proudly and offered to share Toby with him so he'd grow up knowing the same warmth and care that had made their home. And standing together in the quiet house while both children slept, Rebecca and Matthew understood what they had learned: the long way around, that real security and lasting love are never built on grand appearances or on money, but on the quiet, unseen foundations of honest choices, patient care, and devotion that ask for nothing back. If this story reached you, do two things before you go. Subscribe so the next one finds you, and tell me in the comments, when did you first suspect that Matthew was more than he seemed? I read every reply, and I'll see you in the next story.